What if one decision, just showing up, cost someone everything? Because what started as a tense moment inside a Houston restaurant has now turned into a shooting, life-changing injuries, and serious legal questions that could take down more than just the person who pulled the trigger. Now the real question isn't who fired, it's who set it all in motion. What if one moment, just one decision to show up, ended up changing everything forever? Because that's exactly what this situation feels like. It started with whispers, then turned into speculation, and now it's spiraling into something far more serious. A name tied to loyalty, a night filled with tension, and an outcome that no one saw coming. And at the center of it all is a story that keeps getting darker the more you look into it. It begins with a voice, a message that sounds almost emotional, gratitude, appreciation, someone acknowledging loyalty. But right behind that comes something chilling. Rumors spreading fast, claims that someone may never walk again. And just like that, what felt like a small moment online turns into a full-blown storm. Because when people start saying someone has been paralyzed, even before anything is confirmed, you already know this isn't just gossip anymore. This is something bigger. What started as a late-night confrontation didn't stay contained. It didn't fade out or get brushed off. Instead, it escalated into chaos, something that now has people talking about careers being destroyed, lives being permanently altered, and legal consequences that could reach far beyond the person who actually pulled the trigger. Because now the question isn't just what happened, it's who's responsible. According to everything circulating right now, this situation has put Prince Jr. in a position where serious legal trouble could be on the table. Not because he fired a weapon, but because of what may have led up to it. And that's where things get complicated. Because when someone ends up shot multiple times, when someone's future, something as basic as the ability to walk, is suddenly uncertain, people don't just look at the act itself. They look at the chain of events that made it possible. And it all traces back to one night, one location, April 8th, inside a Houston restaurant. At first, it didn't look like anything out of the ordinary. Just another interaction, another moment that could have passed without consequence. But then the energy shifted. Voices got louder. Movements became aggressive. What started as tension quickly turned into something far more serious. Witnesses describe a scene that felt less like an argument and more like an ambush. A group surrounding one individual near an elevator. Chairs moving, people yelling, pressure building in seconds. And right in the middle of it all was someone who didn't even have to be there. Someone who wasn't the target, wasn't directly involved in the original issue, but showed up anyway. That decision, that one act of loyalty, may have cost him everything. Because in the middle of that chaos, something unexpected happened. A weapon fell. And in situations like that, seconds matter, control disappears, instinct takes over. Shots rang out, and just like that, everything changed. People scattered. The noise turned into panic, and when it was over, one person walked away, while another was left on the ground, bleeding, fighting to survive, and now possibly facing a future that will never look the same again. But here's where it shifts from tragic to even more serious. The internet isn't just asking who pulled the trigger. That question alone isn't enough anymore. People are asking who set it in motion. Because if this situation was orchestrated, if calls were made, if people were brought together with intention, if that confrontation didn't just happen by chance, then this isn't just about a shooting. This becomes about responsibility on a completely different level. And if that responsibility can be proven, then the consequences won't just fall on the person who acted in the moment. They could fall on the person who created the moment. To really understand why this situation has hit so hard, you have to look at the people involved. Because none of these names exist in isolation. There's history here, reputation, pressure, and that context changes everything. Prince Jr. isn't just another name. He comes from a legacy that carries weight far beyond music. A legacy built on influence, connections, and a presence that people recognize immediately. In Houston, that name isn't just known, it's respected, protected, and in many ways untouchable. Growing up in that environment doesn't just give you opportunities, It puts expectations on you. It means every move gets watched, every decision carries more impact. But that kind of legacy comes with pressure. Because when your name already holds power, any controversy attached to it feels amplified. And over time, his name hasn't just been linked to business or music, it's been tied to situations that raise questions. Moments that make people look closer and wonder what's really going on behind the scenes. Then there's NBA Ben 10. Not someone chasing attention, not someone building headlines for the sake of it. He's known for loyalty. The kind of loyalty that doesn't waver, the kind that keeps people close in. D situations tight. In that world, loyalty isn't optional, it's everything. And that's exactly why his presence that night matters so much, because he didn't have to be there, but he was. And now, he's the one paying the price. The third piece of this situation adds even more tension. All-Star JR, coming from an environment where respect isn't given freely, it's earned. Someone with presence, someone who doesn't back down easily. Put all three of these individuals in the same place, at the same time, with underlying tension already building, and it's not hard to see how things could escalate. Because this didn't start that night. It didn't begin in that restaurant. According to what's been circulating, this goes back further into something personal. Reports suggest tension connected to a woman, someone tied to All-Star JR's personal life. Allegations that lines may have been crossed. Now, none of that has been officially confirmed, but in environments like this, perception can be just as powerful as truth. Once something personal becomes public, once respect is questioned, things don't stay quiet. They build, they spread, and eventually they reach a point where confrontation feels inevitable. And then you add location into the equation. Houston, not neutral ground, not unfamiliar territory. This is home base for Prince JR, where influence is strongest, where presence carries the most weight. So when someone from outside that circle enters that space, especially with tension already in the background, the situation already has layers before anything even happens. By the time word spread that everyone was in the same place, the outcome almost felt inevitable. Different worlds colliding in one moment. Detroit energy, Baton Rouge loyalty, Houston power, all meeting under pressure. And when you mix all of that together, you don't get a calm conversation. You get unpredictability. You get escalation. You get a situation where one wrong moment can change everything. And that's exactly what happened. And that unpredictability is what defines everything that comes next. Because from that moment on, it stops being about coincidence. It stops being about who just happened to be there. Instead, the focus shifts to something deeper: who was called, who responded, and why they showed up in the first place. Because in situations like this, people don't just appear out of nowhere. Movement like that usually starts with a decision, a message, a signal that turns tension into action. And that's exactly where this story begins to change. Because the second that call allegedly went out, everything crossed a line. Up until that point, this could have been just another tense encounter, two sides crossing paths, exchanging words, maybe even pushing things to the edge but still walking away. That happens more often than people realize. Heated moments don't always turn into violence, but this wasn't one of those situations. This became something else entirely. Because once that information reached Prince JR, once he allegedly learned that All-Star JR was inside that building, a decision was made. And that decision is where everything starts to shift. Because according to what's been circulating, this wasn't random. This wasn't an unexpected run-in. This was something that began forming in real time, piece by piece, building momentum with every second that passed. Reports suggest that once that call happened, it didn't stay a conversation for long. It turned into movement. People started pulling up. Energy started building, and what could have ended quietly suddenly turned into something that felt organized, something that felt intentional. Because instead of the situation cooling down, it escalated. And here's the detail that stands out the most. All-Star JR wasn't looking to fight at that moment. From everything being said, he was actually trying to leave. Not arriving, not stepping into confrontation, but walking away from it, heading toward the elevators, trying to exit before anything could get worse. But he never made it out. Because instead of a clear path, he was met with a group, multiple individuals closing in, cutting off his exit, surrounding him in a way that turned a tense situation into something much more serious. And in that moment, everything changed. This was no longer a disagreement. It wasn't even a heated exchange anymore. It became an ambush. What followed wasn't controlled. It wasn't measured. It was chaos in its purest form. People rushed him. Hands started flying. Chairs became weapons. Chains were being swung. It wasn't one-on-one. It wasn't balanced. It was numbers, overwhelming force, all hitting at once. And in the middle of that storm is where NBA Ben 10 enters the situation in a way that changes everything. Because he wasn't supposed to be the center of this. He wasn't the one with the original issue. He wasn't the target, but he showed up, and in that environment that means something. Showing up isn't. T passive. It's a statement. It means you're standing on loyalty. It means you're backing your people no matter what. It means you're willing to step into something that isn't yours just because of who you stand with. And that's exactly what makes what happened next so heavy. Because in the middle of that chaos, everything flipped in seconds. Not gradually, not predictably, instantly. It all came down to one moment, something nobody planned for. A weapon hit the floor. No control, no warning, just a sudden shift that changed the entire equation. Because up until that second, the situation was about physical dominance, numbers, strength, overwhelming pressure. But the moment that weapon dropped, the entire dynamic changed. And All-Star JR saw it. Because in that moment, he wasn't just part of a fight. He was outnumbered, being overwhelmed, trying to survive. And when that opening appeared, he reacted. Not with hesitation, not with calculation, but with instinct. He grabbed it. And just like that, everything reversed. The same group that had control seconds earlier lost it. The energy in the room flipped instantly. And then the shots rang out. Loud, fast, unpredictable. The kind of sound that doesn't just stop a fight, it ends it. Panic took over. People scattered in every direction. Chaos turned into fear. And within moments, what started as a confrontation became something far more serious. A shooting. When authorities arrived, the scene told the story without needing explanation. Multiple people injured, blood on the ground, and among them, NBA Ben 10, shot multiple times in critical condition, with reports suggesting injuries that could change his life permanently. Let that sink in. Someone who showed up out of loyalty, now possibly facing a future where something as basic as walking is no longer guaranteed. And the person who fired those shots, gone. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody expected. Because the immediate assumption online was clear, people thought the shooter would automatically be treated as the primary suspect, that this would be straightforward. But early indications suggested something very different. Self-defense. Because when you break down the situation as it's being described, the details complicate everything. He was outnumbered. He was being attacked. He didn't bring the weapon into the situation. It came from the other side. And in that moment, he used what was available to survive. And that changes the entire conversation. Because now this isn't just about who got shot. It's about why everything escalated to that level in the first place. Because if the shooting is viewed through the lens of self-defense, then the focus shifts backward. It moves away from the trigger and toward the setup, toward the call, toward the coordination, toward the question of how this situation was created. And that's where the first major shift really hits, because suddenly, the spotlight isn't just on the person who acted in the moment. It's on the person who may have created the moment. Because in cases like this, the law doesn't just look at what happened. It looks at how it happened. It looks at intent. It looks at planning. It looks at whether the environment that led to violence was built intentionally. And if it can be proven that people were called to that location, that movement was coordinated, that the confrontation didn't happen by chance, then responsibility doesn't stop with the shooter. It expands. And that's where things become dangerous. Because now this isn't just a street situation anymore. This becomes a legal situation, a serious one. The kind where the focus shifts from individual actions to collective responsibility, where the question becomes not just who did it, but who made it possible. There's a concept in situations like this that changes everything. You don't have to fire the weapon to be held responsible for what happens next. If investigators can connect the dots, if they can show that this situation was set in motion, that people were brought in with intent, that the confrontation was designed to happen, then the consequences don't just fall on the person who pulled the trigger. They fall on the person who created the conditions for it. And that brings everything back to one question. What actually happened before that moment? Because whatever that answer is, it's going to shape everything that comes next. It will determine how this situation is viewed, not just publicly but legally. And if the full truth comes out, it might not just change the narrative. It could change everything for everyone involved. And just when it feels like the story has already reached its peak, it escalates even further. Because once the dust settled, once the initial shock wore off, people didn't just focus on the shooting itself. They started looking deeper, looking at the moments leading up to it, the decisions, the movements, the connections. And that's when things began to unravel. Because the more details that surfaced, the clearer it became. This wasn't random. This wasn't just a situation that got out of hand. This was a chain reaction. One decision leading to another, each step pushing the situation closer to a point where there was no turning back. At the center of that chain is Prince Jr. Because according to multiple accounts being discussed, everything traces back to that alleged call. The moment he was informed that All-Star Jr. was inside that restaurant and the decision that followed. Because once movement starts based on a call like that, the situation changes. It's no longer contained. It becomes coordinated. It becomes intentional. And most importantly, it becomes predictable in one key way. Violence becomes likely. Think about the elements involved. Tension already exists, rooted in something personal. The location isn't neutral, it's Houston, where influence matters and power dynamics are already in play. Multiple individuals begin showing up, not to resolve anything but to confront. And all of this unfolds in a confined space, late at night, with emotions already running high. That's not a setup for a conversation. That's a setup for something to go wrong. And that's exactly what happened. That was a situation waiting to explode, and that's exactly what it did. But here's where everything takes a turn that nobody saw coming. While the internet reacted emotionally, picking sides, spreading rumors, amplifying the shock, investigators were looking at something completely different. They weren't focused on the noise. They were focused on the sequence. Because in cases like this, the order of events matters more than anything. Who arrived first? Who made the call? Who showed up after that call? Who initiated contact? Every movement, every decision, every second becomes part of a timeline that can't be ignored. And when you start breaking that timeline down, a very specific picture begins to form. Because if it's proven that this confrontation didn't happen naturally, if it's shown that people were brought there with a purpose, if it's confirmed that this wasn't just coincidence but coordination, then everything changes. The entire legal perspective shifts. And that's where things get serious. Because now you're no longer just looking at a shooting. You're looking at something much bigger: conspiracy, coordination, and liability. Under the law, you don't have to be the one holding the weapon to face consequences. If you create the situation, if you set events into motion, if your actions directly lead to violence, you can be held responsible for the outcome. And that's exactly why so many people are watching this situation closely. Because if investigators can connect that alleged call to everything that followed, if they can prove that this wasn't random, then this becomes more than a violent incident. It becomes a case about orchestration, about whether someone used influence to create a moment that spiraled completely out of control. And the second that angle entered the conversation, everything changed. The narrative shifted. It stopped being about who pulled the trigger and started becoming about who caused the trigger to be pulled in the first place. At the same time, the aftermath only made things more intense. Because while all of this was unfolding, one man, NBA Ben 10, was in a hospital bed, fighting through injuries that could permanently change his life. And at the same time, the person believed to have fired those shots wasn't immediately taken into custody. That shocked a lot of people. But when the self-defense angle started gaining traction, it began to make sense, at least from a legal standpoint. Because if someone is outnumbered, if they're being attacked, if they use a weapon that was originally theirs in that moment, the situation isn't viewed the same way as a planned act of violence. It's viewed as survival. And that changes everything about how the law responds. But at the same time, that creates a new layer of tension, because now there isn't just one clear person to blame. Instead, a bigger question starts to take shape. If the shooter acted in self-defense, then who is responsible for putting him in that position? And just like that, everything circles back. Back to the call. Back to the coordination. Back to the idea that this situation didn't just happen, it was built. And then came the detail that pushed the entire story even deeper into controversy. Presence. Because reports and footage confirmed that Prince Jr. wasn't somewhere distant from all of this. He wasn't removed from the situation. He was there, at the location, in the same environment where everything unfolded. And that matters. Because presence, when combined with coordination, creates a connection that investigators can't ignore. On its own, it doesn't prove guilt, but it adds weight, it adds context, it raises pressure. And in cases like this, pressure leads to deeper scrutiny. Meanwhile, outside of the legal world, the public reaction was only getting louder. People weren't just reacting to this one incident anymore. They started looking backward, looking for patterns, bringing up past moments where the same name had been mentioned, situations that, on their own, may not have meant much, but when stacked together began forming a narrative that people couldn't ignore. And that's where things get dangerous. Because once people start connecting dots, whether those connections are proven or not, it shapes perception. And perception, especially in high-profile situations, has power. It influences public opinion. It increases pressure. It can even impact how aggressively a case is pursued. At the same time, another layer of the story started gaining attention. Ben's condition. Because while reports confirmed that he was alive, there was very little clarity beyond that. No detailed updates, no strong reassurance, no clear picture of recovery. And in situations like this, silence doesn't calm people down. It does the opposite. It makes people assume the worst. And that's exactly why the rumors spread so fast. Claims about paralysis, about permanent damage, about a life that may never return to what it was before. Whether confirmed or not, those ideas took over the conversation. Because when information is limited, people fill in the gaps themselves. And those gaps make everything feel heavier. Because now this isn't just about one night anymore. It's about what comes after. A man's future hanging in uncertainty. A possible legal case building in real time. A reputation under pressure. And a situation that keeps getting more complicated with every new detail that surfaces. And through all of it, one thing is clear. this story isn't slowing down. It's building. Because as long as questions remain unanswered, as long as investigators are still connecting pieces, as long as the full truth hasn't been revealed, this situation will continue to escalate. And if the evidence eventually confirms what people are starting to suspect, then what began as chaos inside a Houston restaurant could turn into one of the most serious legal cases tied to the hip-hop world in recent memory. The moment this story hit the internet, it didn't just trend, it took over. Because this wasn't just another incident, it had everything: power, loyalty, violence, and names that carry real weight. And once people realized what might be at stake, the reactions came fast and loud. On one side, the focus was immediate. NBA Ben 10. Sympathy flooded in, because no matter how you look at the situation, one fact doesn't change: he's the one in the hospital. He's the one dealing with injuries that could affect him for the rest of his life. And for a lot of people, that alone defined the entire story. The comments reflected it. He didn't even have the original problem. He showed loyalty, and look what it cost him. This could have been avoided. For many, this wasn't about industry politics or connections. It was about consequences. Because when someone ends up possibly losing their ability to walk, everything else fades into the background. But then there was the other side of the reaction. The side focused on All-Star Jr. And that's where things became even more complicated. Because once the self-defense narrative started gaining traction, people began looking at the situation differently. They started asking whether he had a choice, whether anyone in that position, outnumbered, under attack, surrounded, would have acted any differently. And that split the conversation in two. One side focused on the outcome. The other focused on the moment. And right in the middle of that divide is where the real tension lives. Because this isn't a simple story. It's layered, it's messy, and it's still unfolding. And the truth, it hasn't fully come out yet. They pointed to the moment itself, outnumbered, surrounded, under attack, and to them that changes everything. Because from that perspective, this wasn't a planned act of violence. It was survival, a split-second decision made under pressure, with no time to think, only time to react. And just like that, a completely different narrative took over online. He did what he had to do. Anyone in that position would have reacted the same way. You can't jump someone and expect nothing to happen. And with those arguments, the conversation didn't just grow, it split. Not into right or wrong, but into perspective. Because depending on how you look at it, the exact same situation tells two completely different stories. One sees a victim, the other sees survival, and neither side is backing down. But then the focus shifted again. Because once people started looking beyond the shooting itself, everything began circling back to one name: Prince Jr. And that's where the intensity reached a different level. Because this isn't just any name. This is a name tied to legacy, influence, and a reputation that's been built over decades. So when that name gets connected to something like this, people don't just notice, they react. And they react loudly. Bloggers, commentators, and hip-hop analysts started breaking everything down in real time. Not just what happened, but what it means. Because at this point, the biggest question isn't about the fight anymore. It's about the setup. Was this situation orchestrated? Was that call really made? And if it was, how far does responsibility actually go? Some voices didn't hold back. They started pointing to patterns, bringing up past situations where the same name had been nearby when things went wrong, asking questions that made people uncomfortable. How many times does a name show up before it stops being coincidence? Is this influence or something more? And once those questions hit the internet, they spread fast. But not everyone agreed with that direction. Because at the same time, there were voices pushing back, reminding people that allegations aren't proof, that investigations take time, that social media doesn't decide legal outcomes, and that distinction matters. Because in situations like this, perception moves faster than facts. But even with those warnings, the conversation didn't slow down. It intensified. Because this story taps into something deeper than just one incident. It's not just about what happened inside that restaurant. It's about power, about influence, about what happens when decisions made in seconds create consequences that last a lifetime. And that's why the industry is watching so closely. Because this isn't just about one night anymore. It's about what happens when influence crosses into real-world consequences and whether accountability follows. At the same time, something else was happening quietly in the background. Silence. Because while the internet was loud, while opinions were forming every second, while debates were getting louder, the people at the center of it all remained mostly quiet. And that silence started becoming part of the story. Because when something this big happens, people expect responses, statements, explanations, something to hold on to. But when none of that comes, it creates tension. Because silence can mean a lot of things. It can mean strategy. It can mean legal advice. It can mean waiting for the right moment. But it can also mean pressure. And right now, there's a lot of pressure. Because the more people talk, the more questions get asked, the more attention builds, and the harder it becomes to control the narrative. Which brings everything back to where we are right now. A story with divided opinions. A situation with no clear resolution. And a public watching every move, waiting for something to shift. Because in cases like this, it's never just about what happened. It's about what happens next. And just when it felt like every angle had already been exposed, when the internet had picked sides, broken down every detail, and turned every rumor into a debate, something shifted again. Not loud, not dramatic, but significant. Because while everyone was focused on what happened that night, the attention quietly moved to what's happening now, behind the scenes, in real time. And that's where the real twist begins. Because according to emerging updates, the situation surrounding Prince Jr. may be heading in a direction that can't be ignored anymore. Not speculation, not rumors. Movement, legal pressure. Because when a case like this reaches this level of attention, investigators don't just stop at the obvious. They go deeper. They look at communication, timing, intent, connections, every piece that could explain not just what happened, but why it happened. Because at this point, the biggest question isn't who pulled the trigger. It's who created the moment that made the trigger inevitable. And if that link is established, everything changes. Because now it's no longer about being present. It's about being responsible. And that kind of responsibility doesn't require holding a weapon. It requires influence. It requires action. It requires a decision that set everything in motion. And if prosecutors believe they can prove that, then this situation shifts instantly, from controversy to charges. But while that possibility builds in the background, another reality is unfolding at the same time. NBA Ben 10 is still recovering, still dealing with injuries that could permanently change his life, still facing a future that looks nothing like it did before that night. And the lack of clear updates, that's what makes everything feel heavier. Because when people don't hear progress, they assume the worst. And that's exactly what's happening. The word paralyzed has been spreading everywhere, not officially confirmed, but repeated enough to become part of the narrative. And once a word like that enters the conversation, it changes everything. Because now this isn't just about a shooting. It's about a life that may never be the same again. And that raises the stakes for everyone involved. Because if those reports turn out to be true, then the consequences of that night don't just end with injuries, they become permanent. And permanent consequences lead to permanent questions. Who's responsible? What should have been prevented? Could this have been avoided? At the same time, one detail continues to stand out above everything else: the silence. Because despite the pressure, the speculation, the attention, the key figures in this story still haven't fully stepped forward with complete explanations. No full breakdown. No definitive answers. No clarity. And that silence isn't calming anything down. It's building anticipation. Because silence doesn't end a story like this. It delays the next chapter. And everyone knows it's coming. Because when investigations move forward, when evidence gets reviewed, when footage gets analyzed, something always surfaces. And when it doesn't just add to the story. It changes it. Which brings us to this exact moment. A moment where facts are still being pieced together, where the legal direction is still forming, where the public is divided, and where the outcome is still completely open. Because depending on what comes next, this situation could go in two very different directions. One, where it remains a tragic incident fueled by chaos, bad decisions, and a moment that spiraled out of control. Or the other, where it becomes a full-scale legal case tied to influence, coordination, and responsibility. And if it becomes that second scenario, then everything we've seen so far is just the beginning. Because cases like this don't end quietly. They build. They unfold. And when the truth finally comes out, it usually hits harder than anyone expects. So now the real question isn't just what happened that night. It's what's about to happen next. Because if charges are filed, if statements are made, if new footage is released, this entire situation could flip in an instant. And when it does, there won't be speculation anymore. There will only be consequences. Until then, the story stays open. The pressure keeps building. And the silence keeps getting louder. Now I want to hear from you. After everything, after the alleged setup, the shooting, the uncertainty around Ben 10's condition, and the growing legal pressure, there's still no clear answer to the biggest question. What really happened that night? Do you think this was a situation that spiraled out of control in the moment? Or something more organized from the start? And what about the self-defense angle? Do you believe there was no other option in that moment? Or do you think there's still more to the story that hasn't come out yet? Because depending on how you look at it, this case can go in completely different directions. One perspective sees chaos, bad decisions, and a tragic outcome. The other sees planning, influence, and consequences that go far beyond one person pulling a trigger. Drop your thoughts below. I want to know how you're reading this situation, because this is one of those cases where the audience is just as divided as the facts themselves. And if you made it this far, hit that like button. It helps more people see this breakdown and join the conversation, especially on stories that are still developing like this. And if you want more deep dives like this, real breakdowns, no fluff, no distractions, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the second anything new drops, updates, legal moves, new footage, you already know we're going to be here breaking it all down. Stay locked in. Because this story, it's not over.